Welcome back. In this step, let's start customizing the header and the footer. In the header, I would want actually a number of links. I would want a home link, a to-dos link, maybe a logo down on the left hand corner, and I would want something on the right hand corner for login and logout. So how do we build that? That's what we would start with now. So in the header component, let's start customizing it. So what I would do is I would start using the HTML5 element header. So inside the header, we would need to have a navigation. So I'll say nav, and I would actually remove this div header nav. I would want to create a div with a link to in 28 minutes in here. So the first one would be a link to the in 28 minutes website. After that, I want to have an order list to represent the two menu items I would have in the left. So ULLI/li and ULLI/li. And I'll want one more unordered list to represent the menu elements that we would want to show on the right hand side, login and logout. So this is kind of how we would see this stuff looking like. So login, logout, home, to-dos. So if you want to find more about these classes, go ahead to the Bootstrap website, search for Bootstrap 4 classes, and you should be able to find a lot more information about each of these classes. So I'll add a class called navbar because this is the navigation bar, and I'll add a class called navbar navigation to all the ULs. You can see how now the whole thing is separated out. Class name. So instead of class, actually it's suggested to use class name. And for each of the link, let's add a class called, let's see how this looks like. I'd want all these menus to appear one beside the other and not in the way they are present right now. So I'll add another class to this, navbar expand md. So now everything appears next to each other. So all these login and logout buttons I would want to come over here. So I'll add a couple more classes, navbar hyphen collapse and justify content, and let's see what would happen. You can see that now I have in 28 minutes home to-dos here and login and logout at the end. I would want to have a dark background, so I'll say navbar dark and background dark. Now the menu would have a dark background. That's cool. This specific thing is the name of the brand, so let's add another class on top of this called navbar brand. Let's save this and let's add a href to the website, http://www.in28minutes.com. That's cool. You can see that the menu appears like the header appears a little better right now. And let's add links on top of each of these stuff. So we have home, to-dos, and login, logout. We would want to add links on top of each one of those, right? So let's get started with adding a link, right? So link to is equal to something, and inside that would be the home stuff, right? So home, the link to would be /welcome. To do's, the link would be to do's. Login, the link would be login. And for logout, we don't really have a component yet. We'll create one very soon. So I'll say logout. Actually, the link to home should be /welcome/ in 28 minutes. I would need to hardcode the username in here for now. We'll fix it a little later. And we saw that all the formatting got lost. Actually, we needed to add the class name on the link class. So let's add class name on the link class for each one of these. And remove it from the li. I know it's like a little boring to just keep adding a little bit of classes here and there. I mean, you'd want your pages to look good. So that's why let's spend a little bit of effort to make sure that we have everything working fine. So home, to-dos, home, actually this should be login. So let's change this login. Home, to-dos, login, and logout. So home, to-dos, login. Logout will not work for now. We'll fix that a little later. So we have the header working perfectly right now. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. In this step, let's look at the footer and the logout components. We created the logout link, but right now the logout link takes to an error page, and we did not really customize the footer properly yet. So let's look at both of these in this specific step. What I'll do is I'll start with the logout component. So footer component, I'll copy it and I'll call this logout component. And inside the logout component, all that I would want to div return is, let's say inside a div, let's have a h1 you are logged out. And let's also have a div with a class name is equal to container. This is basically a bootstrap class container. You can see what magic it brings in. And we'll say, thank you for using our application. And I don't really need a div in here, so I'll leave it as an empty fragment. That's also fine. So we are just creating a logout component. We need to map the logout component to the router. So let's go to the route and add logout in here and /logout. So we have the logout mapped. That's cool. So you can see that when I do logout, it says you're logged out. Thank you for using our application. So all links here are now in a working state. That's cool. Let's now customize the footer a bit. You can see that searching for components is becoming more complex as the size of this class grows. What we'll do at a later point is actually split out the components into an individual into their own individual component files or individual modules. For the footer also, let's use the HTML5 footer element. So footer, we'll add a class name on it. Footer, will style it using this a little later. For now, let's configure what's inside here. Let's add a span and add a specific class name. I mean, we are going to show some copyright information, so I'll just say it's muted. Actually, it should be text muted. And over here, I'll just paste in some text. It does not really matter what that text is. So what we are doing in here is basically configuring a simple footer. And what we would want is also to configure a little bit of styling for the footer. So what I'll do is I'll add a little bit of styling in here. So dot footer, and add styling for that specific footer. So if you look at the page right now, the footer shows here, but what we want to do is we want to make the footer appear at the bottom. Let's make the position of the footer as absolute, because we would want it always at the footer. Let's add a bottom 0 to make it appear at 0 pixels. Let's set a width. Let's say it takes all the width available, and let's say it's of height 40 pixels, and let's give it a background color. Let's just say it's #2222. Now we have a header and a footer at the bottom. Home, to-dos, login, logout, and a header and the footer. In this step, we created the logout component and the footer component. We added a little bit of styling for the footer component as well. I know over the last few steps we are focused on styling, and styling might be a little boring for a lot of people down there. We'll do one more step of styling before we get back into the real functionality of React. We will start looking at how we would add security on top of our application and do wonderful stuff along with it. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. In the previous step, we created the logout component and we updated the footer component to have the right styling. In this step, let's focus on each of the individual components and style them better. So we'll start with the login component, we'll then go to the welcome, and then we would go to the list to-dos. So let's start with the login component. Let's add a h1 and say login, and then we would add a div around this. Oops, actually it should be div, and let's give it a class of container, and we'll put it around all this stuff, and let's format this a little. The login successful message, we are not going to show it anyway, so you can actually remove this out. For the invalid credentials, it's kind of a warning, so let's add actually again I'm going back to the old convention of using class. It should be class name. It should be class name is equal to invalid credentials is a warning, so I'll use alert warning. I'll leave the username and password as they are. All that I'll do is on the button I'll have a few more classes added in. Class name is equal to, it's a button and it's a success button. Now you can see that the login page is much better aligned. So in 28 minutes dummy, I can go now into the welcome page. So now let's go to the welcome page and format it. So now I'm formatting the welcome component. What I'll do is I'll just press enter over here and start afresh. So we'll start with an empty fragment. We'll add a h1 and we'll say welcome. And we'll add a div with class is equal to container and copy this text in. Let's remove these divs out. Actually, I could have reused the divs instead of creating a new one here, but that's okay. We have the welcome component done. Let's see how it looks. Okay, cool. So now you go to the login in 28 minutes dummy and do login. You get to the welcome page. If you go to the login, if you invalid password, you get an invalid credentials. So that's cool. The UI is looking pretty decent right now. The next page that we need to focus on is the list to dos, right? So let's go to the list to dos page. This is where it is. So we have a div already present and we also have a h1 here. So what I'll do is I'll actually add in another div around the table alone. So around the table I'll add another div and I'll give it a class of container. Class is equal to container so that we get some space around it. And let's push this table a little, and then what we'll do is we'll give this a class of table. Cool. Now we have a list to dos and we have the table displayed in here. You can see that the table is much better looking right now. What I'll also do is I'll remove the ID field because ID does not really make sense on a to-do page, right? Who cares what the ID of a to-do is? So this is how the page looks right now. Home, to-dos, and the login page and the logout page. This step brings us to the end of all the styling that we were doing for the last few steps. What we'll do starting next step is focusing on the functional features. One of the things that you would have already seen is the fact that when I log in, I go down to the welcome page. But you don't really need to log in to go to the welcome page. You can directly type a URL and directly go to the welcome page. You can directly click to-dos and go to the to-dos page, even without doing the login. How can we prevent that? That's basically what we would start looking at in the next few steps. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. Until now, in all the previous steps, we did not really authenticate the user, whether he has logged in or not, before we actually take the user to a specific link. So all the pages appear even though a user has not really logged in. Now, the question is, how do we track if a user has logged in or not? One of the options which is available to track whether a user has logged in or not is something called a session storage. If you look at all the browsers, they have something called session storage. And whatever we put in session storage is available to the application while user is logged in into the current browser window session. So if you do a right click inspect and go down to the application tab, I'm using Chrome obviously. You can check out this storage section where if you expand this, you can see that this specific application does not really have anything in session storage. What we can do is when a user logs in, we can set a key into session storage. And when a user logs out, we can remove the key out. And we can use that to check if a user has logged in or not. The great thing is if you close the browser window and come back, the session storage is completely cleared out. Thereby, a user would be treated as if he is logged out. What we'll do in this step is we'll try and put something into session storage when a user logs in. So when a user logs in successfully in 28 minutes dummy and clicks login, what we want to do is we would want to put an entry in the session storage that the user has logged in. In the next steps, we will make use of this specific key, token, whatever you want to call it, and use it to check before we render all the other pages. Let's get started now. So if we look at the login click method, this is the method which is called when login is clicked on the to-do app, actually on the login page. We are checking if the user ID password is fine. This is hard-coded for now. If it is fine, what we want to do is we would want to put something in session storage. What we'll do is all the interaction with session storage, we would do it through a new module. So what I'll do is on to do, I'll create a new file. I'll call this authentication service.js. This would be a JavaScript file. So I'll create a authentication service class, and what I will do here is I'll create an instance of it. Export default. I'll create an instance of it and export it. So what happens is now this class is available to to-do app. So if I want to make use of this authentication service, what should I do in the to-do app? I should import it. So I'll say import authentication service from /authentication service. So the authentication service is now available. Let's create a simple method in here. I'll call this method. What we want to do in here is we would want to register the fact that a user has really logged in. So we'll create a method for that, and I'll call this register successful login, and I'll have two parameters to this. One is the username and the other one is the password. So once a user has successfully logged in, what we want to do is we would want to be able to put a value in the storage. How do we do that? Into the session storage. So if you look at JavaScript directly provides something called session storage. So if you do session storage dot set item, you can say, let's just say authenticated user. Authenticated user, comma, username. Let's not use the password for now. The password, let's not really worry about it for now. For now, what we have done is we created a simple method, authentication service. Actually, we created a class and we created a method in it, register authentication service, and we exported an instance of this authentication service. Now the to-do app, we already imported the authentication service instance. So what we can do in the login component, when login is clicked, what we can do is we can say authentication service dot register successful login. And to make sure that this specific method is called, what I'll also do is do a console.log register successful login. Let's save to do app as well, and let's see what's happening in the browser. Okay, it says when I go to the browser, I see an error. It says I am unable to import authentication service.jsx. The reason is because since the extension of this file is JSX, it's thinking the authentication service is also a JSX file. It's not, it's a JS file. So let's just say authentication service.js, and when I go back, there's another error. It says cannot call a class as function. The reason is because I forgot the new keyword in here. So we want to create a new instance of this. So let's see what happens. Now you can see that we have the page rendering. I'll go to the login and do login dummy. Let's see what's happening in the console and say login. You can see that register successful login is present, and also you can see that authenticated user, the value is undefined. Why is it undefined? It's undefined because we did not pass the username and password. So let's pass the username and password. How do we pass the username and password? This.state.username and this.state.password. So let's pass them in, and let's again retry. Login in 28 minutes dummy and login. Now you can see that in session storage we have something called authenticated user in 28 minutes. You'd see that as long as I am on this application, this value would remain in here. It's not really going out from here at all. So in this step, what we did is we created the authentication service, and we used it to make sure that whenever user tries to log in and he logs in successfully, we set something into the session storage so that we know that a user has successfully logged in. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. In the previous step, we talked about session storage, and you might be wondering, why did we not use the local storage? One of the important things about local storage is that once you set a value into it, once you set a key into it, it will not be deleted until you explicitly delete it. So even if the user closes the browser and comes back, the key would still remain there. So it's not really considered secure, and that's the reason why we use session storage, which is cleared as soon as you close the browser and go out. Now, let's get to the problem at hand. At login, we added a key value pair into session storage. Is that sufficient? We also need to remove it at some time. When do you remove it out? We need to do it at logout, right? So that's what we would start with in this specific step. When a user clicks logout, what we want to do is we would want to remove out this key from the session storage. Let's go to our header component, and what I'll do is when somebody clicks a logout button, so on click of the logout button, what I would want to do is I would want to call a specific method. What is the method that I would want to call? Let's define it right now. So authentication service reaches successful login, and the next method is logout. And what do we want to do on logout? What we want to do on logout is session storage dot remove item. So we just want to remove the item authenticated user. So let's do that. And what we can do now is authentication service, authentication service dot logout. So what we are doing in here is we are mapping the on-click event to this method call. So whenever somebody clicks logout, what happens? The value from the session storage gets removed. One of the important things is you should not do this, right? This is a method call. What we are doing is mapping an event. So you need to put a reference. So authentication service dot logout. That's it. Let's save both the files and let's get working. Now we can see that there is this authenticated user, a key in here, because that's what happened when we did the login. Now let's click the logout. You can see that the authenticated user is removed out from the session. That's cool, right? So when user logs in, you put something into the session storage, and when user logs out, you remove it out. That's pretty cool. But we are not really using any of this stuff in the application yet. In the next few steps, let's start doing it. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. In this step, let's get to the fun stuff. What we'll try and do is enable and disable menu items based on whether a user has logged in or not. So right now, all the menu items are shown irrespective of whether a user is logged in or logged out, right? Let's try and customize the menu. I will need to look for the header component, and in the header component, what we want to do is we would want to check if a user has logged in or not. If user has logged in, then we would want to enable a few links. Otherwise, we need to disable them. How can I find out if a user has successfully logged in or not? Right now, there is no method which is present in here. Let's create a method. Let's call this is user logged in. And what does it need to check? What we can do is first we'll get the user. We can get the value from the session storage. So let session storage dot get item and authenticated user. One of the things I can see here is we are using this a number of times. Later we would move this to a constant file. For now, let's say let user is equal to session storage dot get item authenticated user. We are getting the user from the session storage. If user is equal to null. So if user is null, then what shall we do? Return false. Otherwise, return true. Does this look good? So basically we are checking if whatever value we are getting from the session storage is null. If it's null, then the user is not logged in. Otherwise, is logged in, return true. What I'll do in here is I'll call that method. I'll say constant because it's a constant, right? Once you assign a value, it's not going to change. Is user logged in is equal to authentication service dot is user logged in. So let's call this, and what I'll do is I'll do a console.log of is user logged in. Let's first make sure that we are getting the right value in here. Let's look at the console. Let's click one of the links which is present in here. Oops, actually I'm getting an error saying invalid DOM property class. We'll fix that a little later, but you can see that it says false. Let's log in and see in 28 minutes dummy, and now let's go further down and see. You can see that this is printing true. So what is happening is once we log in, this value is being printed as true. Now we need to use that value which is present in here. Let's comment the logout. We need to use this value is user logged in to enable or disable links. How can we do that? We need to show this link only when user is logged in, right? So how do we do that? We already talked about the AND operator, and we said this is shown only if this is true, right? We can use the same thing inside the header component right now. So what I'll do is actually I'll highlight this link and press open brace. So this would enclose the whole thing out, and here I would actually use the is user logged in and what happens, this link will be shown only if user has logged in. So I'll copy this, and again the same with the to-dos link. We would want to show the to-dos link only if the user is logged in. So I'll again highlight the link and press open brace and then copy this in. So this is how the code looks right now, and let's do the same thing on the logout button as well. So only if a user has logged in, let's allow him to log out, right? So we are putting open brace, close brace, and is user logged in. Now the login button, when should we show it? The login button should be shown when user is not logged in. So I'll say not is user logged in, do this, right? Let's check this. You see that now the login button is not shown. Because why is it not shown? Because if you go to the application tab, we have this token in the session storage. If I do a logout, you can see that only the login button is now being shown. You can see that it's cleared out from session storage and we only have the login button shown. Isn't that cool? One of the things that irritates me is the fact that there are a few errors which are present in here. There are a few places where we are still using class. Let's actually fix that right away. Let's search for class is equal to and replace it with class name. Class name. Class is equal to class name. Okay, I could have done a replace all, but I just wanted to be clear about what all places we were using it. Now it's cool. So now let's go into the browser, clear the console, try and log in again. In 28 minutes, dummy, login. Okay, cool. We have home to do and we have logout. We have stuff coming out of it here. There is another warning which we are seeing. Each child in the list should have a unique key property. So if you click the link, you would see that it says every child in a specific list. So in this specific list of items, everything should have a unique key. How do we do that? The way you can add a key is just by saying key is equal to do. We can use the ID of the to do as the key. So this would give something unique for React to keep track of this tr, and if something changes, it would use this specific key as the starting point. So now if I refresh, you'd see that there is no error now being highlighted. That's cool. I'll just make the description as caps D, and let's go to home, to do's. Let's do a logout, login again. Try and play around with it and see if you see any warnings which are present. In this step, what we were focusing on was to enable and disable the menu items based on whether a user is logged in or not. We also fixed a few other minor warnings. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. In the previous step, we disabled the menu links based on whether a user has logged in or not. But there are cheating users who would do this. They would type in the URL and get to that, right? So even though user has not really logged in, he's able to get to the URL. How do we prevent it? We need to do some magic. We need to authenticate before we need to route. That's basically what we would do in this specific step. So until now, we were using the route, right? So over here, we actually use the route and we say this is the path, this is the component, this is the component to route to. What we would want to be able to do is we would want to be able to say authenticated route. If somebody tries to access the welcome page or the to-dos page, what we want to do is make sure that he's logged in and only then allow the user to go to the route. Let's undo the changes. Let's start creating the authenticated route component. So right click, new file, authenticated route.jsx. So this would be a component. So very simple, class authenticated route extends component. Let's create the render method. We need to return something back from there. We need to import React, component from the React module. What do we want to do in the render? If user is logged in, then we would want to redirect him to the route. Otherwise, we would want to redirect him to the login page. So how do we find out if the user has logged in? If we just created the authentication service, right? So let's use that. If authentication service dot is user dot. So if authenticated service dot user logged in, then what we want to do is we would want to redirect him to the route. What we want to do is when we change this to authenticated route, what would happen is all the parameters would be passed to authenticated route. What we want to do is we would want to take all these props and also pass them to the route. How do we do that? The way we can do that is by using something called ... this dot props. What we are doing in here is called a spread operator. What is the spread operator? Let's quickly take a look. Now, let's say there is a simple array. So I'm creating a simple values array 1, 2, 3, and let's say there is a simple function called sum. So let's define a function sum, and let's say it's accepting three parameters, a comma b comma c, and let's say it's actually returning a plus b plus c, which is the sum of all the three. So sum adds all this stuff up, right? Cool. Now if I call sum with, let's say, 45, 60 and 90, what would happen? It would return 195 back. Cool, right? That's exactly as expected. I would want to use the values from this array and call the sum. How can I do that? The way you can do that is by saying sum of values of 1 actually I should start with 0, right? Index starts from 0, values of 1 comma values of 2. That's basically what we would need to do, right? It gives 6. Instead of that, JavaScript provided something called a spread operator. What you can do is you can say sum of dot 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 values. What happens is all the elements in this array would be passed as an individual parameter. So what happens is 1 will be mapped to A, 2 will be mapped to B, 3 will be mapped to C. This is called the spread operator. What we want to do is, if the to-do app is passing to the authenticated route different parameters, we need to exactly pass the same parameters out to the route. Instead of individually defining those properties, what I'm doing is taking out the easier route. So I'm saying take all the properties and spread them out. Else, what do we need to do? We need to redirect the user. Where do we need to redirect the user to? We need to redirect the user to login page. As simple as that. Let's make sure that we have all the imports right. So let's import route and redirect from where do this come from? From the React router down. Let's also import authentication service from / authentication service .js. Let's save this. Now let's go to the to-do app. Which all routes do we want to be authenticated? So if somebody is coming to the welcome page, we want it to be authenticated. If somebody is coming to the list to-dos component, or actually the to-dos link, we would want it to be authenticated. Logout should also be authenticated, obviously, right? Only if you have logged in, you will be able to log out as well. So I'm making these routes as authenticated. Let's import it in as well. Import authenticated service from /authenticated. Actually, import authenticated route from /authenticated route .jsx. One of the important things is over here we are not really doing the default export. So export default authenticated route. Let's do that quickly. So this component is available in this specific thing as well. Let's go to the browser and let's look at the authenticated route.jsx. It says render method should have a return statement. Absolutely. How can I not return this back? What should I do? I should actually return these back. Cool. Now you'd see that I'm able to see the login button. So basically the user is not yet logged in, and if I go to to-dos, he's redirected down to the login page. If I'm going to welcome and say welcome in 28 minutes, going back to the login page, and if I enter the values and go to login and now click the home page or to-dos page, I'll be able to go there. But if I say log out and then try to go to to-dos, nope, it does not really allow me to do that. Isn't that cool? So now we have an almost perfect system. We have a hard-coded authentication and we have hard-coded to-dos and stuff. That's what we would fix over the next few steps. But effectively, we have a good system. Only if a user is logged in, he'll be able to see the details. If he does not know the user ID and password, he'll never be able to go in and check any of the details. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. One of the problems that you would be facing right now is finding the components and making the changes inside the to-do app. The to-do app is becoming very, very big. It's almost 200 lines of code. What we'll do now is we'll refactor it out. So what we'll do is we'll actually move at least the most important components out to separate files. So let's start with the login component, which is one of the most important components which is present in here. Let's start with actually trying to move it to a separate file. So right click, new file. I'll call this login component.jsx. As with the authenticated route, what I would do is I would import all this stuff in. So you would basically have these imports present. Also copy this from here. Make sure that we are copying the entire login component, including the render. Cool. And now I would move it down to the login component. At the end, I would export class login component. Export default, not class. That's why it's giving me a compilation error. Let's see if there are things which are not used. Yeah, this input is not used in here, so that's cool. And what I'll do is I'll go to to-do app.jsx, importing login component from /login component.jsx. Let's save this. I'm sure there will be errors. Oops, nope, we got it right first attempt. That's cool. So home, to-dos, everything is working fine. So we were able to perfectly refactor out the login component very, very quickly. Now you can pause the video in here and try and refactor the list to do's component into its own component or into its own module. I'll start doing it right now. So I'll go to this, I'll cut this out. This is the, let's copy the name so that we have it, list to do's component. And what we want to do is we would want to move it to its own file. So inside the to do, new file, list to do's component.jsx. That should be the name. Let's add that in. Let's add the usual imports and let's add a export default list to do's component. And in the to do component, in the to do app, what do we need to do? We need to now do the same thing for list to do's component. Let's do that quickly. Cool. Saved. Let's see if list to do's continues to work. Yep, list to do's continues to work as it is. And let's see if this is actually coming from here. Let's actually make a small change. Is completed. To do's. Yep, this is where it's coming from. So you can see that separating out things into individual modules is not too difficult, and actually over a period of time it would make our application very maintainable. What I'll do now is, instead of doing it one by one, I'll actually start creating a number of components at the same time and start moving them at the same time. So we would start with header component, right click, new file, header component.jsx. I'll also do a import in here just so that I have a template which I can copy around all the time. So in the header component, I'll put this, and also I'll actually do a export default. It's kind of a shortcut. So what I'll do is I'll copy this, and now I'll keep changing the name. So header component, footer component. What other stuff do we have to create? Header, footer, logout component. Let's copy this, Control C, Control V, and change. If you press enter, you can actually read component.jsx. The next thing which we want to use, header, footer, we have welcome and error component. So welcome component, let's copy it again, and I would want to call this the error component.jsx. So now we have a lot of files with errors. Let's fix all of them very quickly. So let's go back to the app.jsx. Let's start with the error component. I'll say export function error component, export default error component. Cool. I'll go to the to do app and add an import for it. Import error component from /error component.jsx. That's cool. Now let's go to the welcome component, whatever is next in here. So we have the header component in here. Let's quickly move that out as well. Header component, the name is header component. So export default header component. Save this in the to do app. Let's go to the top and let's say import header component from /header component.jsx. Cool. Header component is moved. Footer component is next. So footer component, where do you need to go? Where's your file? Here it is. And let's move them in here. Footer component, export default footer component, and let's import it in as well. Import footer component from /footer component.jsx. the last two things remaining are the logout and the welcome component. Let's move the logout component down here and let's do a export default logout component, and in the to do app import it in. So import from /logout component.jsx. The last thing which is remaining is the welcome component, and let's now move the welcome component out as well. I'm sure there would be a few errors when we actually see the application in the browser. That's fine. It's always good to be trying to resolve errors because that's how you learn. JSX, cool. I'm sure there are missing imports. So it's saying link is not defined in welcome component. That's cool. Link is from React Router DOM. So where is it used? Welcome component. So in the welcome component you need link. Oops, there is this import present twice. I don't need it. So I'll add link. I don't need the other stuff in here. So let's save it. Now the header component has a few errors. It's saying authentication service link. We want to get the authenticated service and the link. So import link and authentication service. Cool. Header component is fine. Oops, everything is fine. So now home, to-dos. When I do a logout, I go to the login page. I'll do invent dummy. I'm able to go in. So looks like everything is fine. We were able to refactor it successfully. I'm sure it was a very interesting experience to refactor stuff into their own components. The great thing from now on is whenever you want to make a change, you can just search for that specific file and make the change. And if you look at the to-do component right now, it looks much more simpler. What I'll do is I'll remove this specific commented code which is present in here. I kind of leave a lot of commented code in because a lot of students like to have history of what was changed. That's the reason why I leave commented code most of the times, but sometimes it makes it confusing to understand. So if you don't really want to have the commented code, I would recommend you to remove all the commented code in all these components as well. In this step, we basically refactored out things. We created individual modules for each of the components and made the entire application simpler to maintain over a long duration of time. I'll see you in the next step. Bye-bye. Welcome back. In the previous few steps, we made a lot of progress with the application. We actually added in a lot of cool features. When a user logs in, we are storing the fact that he has logged in session storage, and when user logs out, we are removing it from the session storage, and we are using that to authenticate access to the user. If I want to access the to-dos link, I should be logged in. If I log out and do it, nope, that's not allowed. In addition to that, in one of the previous steps, we also customized the menu. We made sure that based on whether a user has logged in or not, we are showing the right details inside the menu. we have learned a lot of useful React features. We talked about routing first, then we talked about how to create an authenticated route, and also we talked about how to disable and enable links in the menu. And we learned how to put a token into session storage when a user logs in and how to use it across the application. There are still a few rough ends to this specific application. Most of the data in the application is hard-coded, and that's what we would change in the next section. We would start building our APIs, we'll start building our backend services so that our to-dos page, the authentication services, and everything can start talking to real APIs. I'm excited with the direction that we are heading. I'm sure you are learning a lot, and I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye.